Welcome everyone, and thank you for making your time available for such an early start. It's an important issue, but before the meeting gets started, I thought that I would take advantage of the fact that I'm in the chair and to just notify all councillors of the status. In fact, it's entirely appropriate for today, the Avon Heathcote Estuary Ihutai certificate of participation in the Flyway Site Network, and this was announced by the Minister of Conservation yesterday, and I'd like to thank all of the councillors who turned up for that. It was an amazing turnout, as I think one of the participants commented. We could have had a quorum there and dealt with this yesterday, but it's a really significant status for us to have acknowledged, and I wondered if I handed it over to the Chief Executive whether perhaps it could be displayed in New Brighton. I thought the New Brighton Library might be sort of, in terms of proximity, or potentially one of the other libraries over the other side, but I just think it's such a wonderful recognition of the special role that our estuary plays that I make a formal presentation at the start of this meeting, which seemed entirely appropriate.
Thank you.
There you go.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Right. I can see that there's wild enthusiasm for that particular little... Thank you very much. Okay, so in front of us we have, well, first of all, apologies, and I think we've got everyone here except for Councillor Livingston, who is with us in spirit, and every now and again his voice will waft into the conversation. Not now, though, thank you, Glenn. And declarations of interest, we haven't any of those. And so we'll move on to item 3, draft section 71 proposal to amend the district plan in relation to the residential unit overlay for consultation. And before I begin, can I just acknowledge staff? You've done an extraordinary job in a very short space of time. I know that when the advice came in from Sarah Dawson to support the work that you were doing so early, so quickly, it represented an opportunity to bring things forward, and you'd already committed to meeting with the community boards and the local communities last Thursday, and to have a turnaround like this. You know, we take our hats off to you and thank you very much for the work that you've put into it. So we're on this journey, and I'd perhaps like to hand over. Is it to you, Brendan, to sort of do a few introductory remarks?
That would be great, thanks, Leanne.
Thank you.
So I thought I'd just remind all councillors about the process, and then briefly talk about the content as well. And I appreciate that a couple of questions have come in that we'll do our best to answer as well. So just to remind everyone about the process that's been undertaken. So on the back of Councillor Johansson's notice of motion, I think 5 weeks ago, Council asked staff to report on options for resolving the matter related to the residential unit overlay and the policy settings within that. On the 27th of September, staff reported back with a range of options, and Council resolved to undertake a Section 71, which was the approach that had the greatest likelihood and certainty, and also offered the most advantages in terms of the timeframes. As part of that report back on the 27th of September, Council also requested that staff work closely with former members of the Independent Hearings Panel in their new capacity, not in any capacity related to the IHP, as well as the community boards, the 2 relevant community boards, and variety of community groups of interest to this matter. So that has been undertaken. Staff have worked very closely, as Leanne has said. We've received feedback from Sarah Dawson, who was on the Independent Hearings Panel but is an independent planning commissioner, and so she's provided comprehensive advice back to us. The basis of that advice was the staff submission to the IHP originally, which included the policy. So Sarah's used that as the basis and has made some amendments to that policy. In addition, we've also had a constructive session with the two community boards and a number of the coastal groups, including CCRU. That was a productive session. Most of those groups have said that they're very happy with the proposed changes. Unfortunately, one of the groups is not happy with the proposed changes. I'm more than happy to talk about that if there are questions. But we've taken most of the groups on this journey and they're supportive of these changes. Where we're now at in terms of the content is that we have for you a draft Section 71, or it's called a Section 65 proposal, and that has a revised policy. So policy 5.2221B, and that provides the clarity we believe that was sought and was missing in the final decision of the IHP. In addition to the reintroduction or amendments to the policy, we are also proposing to introduce a permitted activity for rebuilds on vacant land. And currently we have what's called a P1, which is the first permitted activity. We're proposing to introduce a new P2, second permitted activity, and that will affect between about 30 and 40 vacant properties where there was a dwelling, a home on the property at the time of the September earthquakes, but between September 2010 and this chapter of the IHP of the district plan becoming operative in November 2016, the home was demolished. Inadvertently, what's happened is that people in that situation haven't been captured by the first permitted activity, and we think it's the fair and right thing to do to provide some recompense that is generally, it's not the same as, but it's generally equivalent to what would be allowed under existing use rights to allow those people to rebuild with same or similar ground floor footprints as long as there is a dwelling at the start of the earthquake sequence. So that's the process and the content. As Leanne said, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank a number of staff involved. Mikey Anderson, who's at the end of the table, has done an amazing job and ably supported by Brent and David, and also Nathan and John from the resource consenting team have been fantastic. They've all attended the community sessions and they've done a spectacular job in understanding this and being able to articulate and explain to community members a number of real-world situations and also some of the scenarios about what this will mean for the future. So they've done that under tight time pressures and they've done it at a time of quite considerable scrutiny. So I'd just like to recognise them. So that is the introduction, Leanne. We're more than happy to take questions.
That's fine. Okay. But I'm just zap around the table because I can see that there's a number of questions. Andrew, do you have any questions? Brad? Jimmy? David? Anne? Jamie? Sarah?
Thank you. There's been an enormous amount of work going into this, which is great. Just wondering, so you mentioned the last time we were here that it was potentially going to capture more of the HFA area, and so the words predominantly affected by sea level rise have been added to condense that. Though we're not looking at just limiting it to the residential unit overlay, do we know how many additional properties might be captured by that wording? Do you now?
Yeah, we've done some work in that area,
right.
And we've identified. No, you can talk to Mikey.
No worries.
But we have done some work to look at that to address that question.
So the areas that we've been able to identify that would fit outside of the residential unit overlay is a small area of Aranui. It's around sort of Pages Road near Anzac Drive. So at the moment we've only really been able to just do a desktop exercise, so it's not exact numbers or anything, but it looks to be around 70 properties in that area, and so that's ones that currently have a house on and also vacant sites as well. So it's not saying that every single one of those properties would be used in these roles, but that's sort of the extent in there, and then a few additional properties in Spencerville as well, around 10 in that little pocket. So we're really talking quite discrete areas outside the residential unit overlay that would also fall within this.
Okay. But so they would be captured by the policy, but not by the new rule, because the rule is
Absolutely,
RUO
yes.
specific.
Yes, so they would still require non-complying resource consent.
Yeah.
And then when they go for their resource consent, they'd be able to be assessed against this policy as well.
Great, cool. And the rule wording, I just noticed that the letter both from Sarah Dawson and the one from the lawyers both reference the policy, but neither have made commentary on the new rule wording. And in fact, the lawyer's letter is really clear that it's very important that the construction of a residential unit within the RUO is a restricted discretionary activity and not a permitted activity. And yet the rule that we're proposing to put in would make it a permitted activity.
Yeah, so this is a very small number, I think
30 odd.
32
Yeah.
or something. And we met with Sarah Dawson last week on Tuesday, I think, to go through the approach, to talk to her about the policy that she and the letter that she'd written. Yeah. And we put this rule in front of her as well and talked through that with her.
Yeah.
And she felt that it was she was very comfortable with what we were doing.
Okay.
Well, she didn't give
there's no formal opinion on.
No formal opinion on it
from any external.
But she there was no allergic reactions to it either.
Okay, and have the lawyers been approached, Brookfield's lawyers, on that one? No.
No, we didn't seek Brookfield's advice on the addition of the permitted activity rule.
Okay.
Because what they were advising on was the way the policy would work in relation to building where the building required resource consent.
That's right.
The notion of there being a permitted activity, a change to the permitted activity rule for those spare sections where there had been a building until the earthquakes was a extra policy analysis that was done by council staff.
Right, yeah, because he makes it quite clear on paragraph 17 that it's important that everyone get a resource consent in this area.
Just give me a moment to have a look at that.
Page 34.
No, what? That's paragraph 17. Isn't an expression of opinion on policy or strategic planning matters by Brookfields.
Yeah.
Paragraph 17 is Brookfields simply making clear to any readers of the new policy that the policy doesn't make the activity a permitted activity.
Okay.
It's simply trying to make that point. What it's not doing is giving strategic or planning advice to the council as to whether there should be an extra permitted activity standard.
Okay, thanks. And just something that was raised this morning, which group wasn't happy and why with the new proposed policy and rule?
The South Brighton Residents Association, the chair, which is Hugo Christensen, and Semaso Cromthal as the secretary. I received an email from them on Friday evening. The South Brighton Residents Association does not support the proposed wording to amend the Christchurch District Plan using Section 71 in the absence of protection measures against flooding and erosion and the remediation of earthquake damage in our suburb, which the council has been promising to investigate for 2 years. The measures outlined at yesterday's meeting will not materially assist South Brighton residents to rebuild their homes and lives. And there's a good goal.
So it doesn't go far enough for them. The council doesn't go far enough as opposed to the policy.
So Hugo and the South Brighton Residents Association were at the meeting on the Thursday evening. It did seem as though their particular interest was less about the correcting the residential unit overlay issue, but more related to historical issues that they've raised repeatedly with council.
Yeah. Just a couple of last bits. Is there anything in the policy, and it's not in the rule because the rule is for the rebuilds, but is there anything in the policy which allows it, which would make it easier for people to build new dwellings on sections that were vacant prior to, so ones through subdivision? So it's not going to change anything for those properties that didn't have a dwelling on them to start with.
Well, I think you've raised two separate things there.
Yeah, so there's two separate things. So there's the properties that had a house on them prior to the earthquakes and they've been demolished and, you know, getting the ability to rebuild back, which is a really good thing. And then there's those sort of 40-odd sections that had never had a dwelling on them. Does the new policy wording make it easier for these people? Because I know these people have been struggling as well. Doesn't it?
It will allow for, it will make it clearer what types of things they will need to consider. So the policy wording around being, you know, focusing it around the areas predominantly influenced by sea level rise, so that's going to be a focus of the assessment there as well, and looking at appropriate mitigation. So it will allow for, and it's about providing for rather than avoiding in the first instance. So it will use that as a starting point. So saying, if you're a vacant site and you're looking to, and you never had a property on before the earthquakes, is what you're proposing appropriate in the area that you are based on the future risk of sea level rise that could create?
It's covered by the
high
restricted discretionary rules. It's restricted discretionary. You can't create a new discretionary criteria. It has to be the discretion. I always find it confusing because restricted discretionary makes it sound like it's more restrictive, but it's not. It's more open, and it's the second least most restrictive planning environment for a resource consent requirement, isn't it? I mean,
yes, that's true.
Discretionary comes after it.
Yes, so the policy also helps focus that when you're assessing for a resource consent, and so the changes that we're proposing to the policy will help that assessment, will make it a lot clearer. So, you know, looking at what mitigation's been proposed, is it appropriate, and then if it's not, that's when something might be declined, as opposed to the other way round, which was how the policy was framed previously. So,
there is a disputed opinion as to whether the avoid overrode the rule anyway. So it's the independent hearings panel was explicit. A residential unit overlay was the relief that was granted, and it's a restricted discretionary planning environment, not a non-complying one. You know, non-complying doesn't mean you can't apply for a resource consent. You can, but it's a more restrictive environment than. But this creates an easier framework for the planners to operate in. But the planners have been bending over backwards to assist people to get resource consent, and I think what this will do is just make it crystal clear that it doesn't.
So, a couple of last...
can I just it doesn't make it guaranteed,
no,
crystal clear is perhaps in the definition, not in the outcome of that.
Yeah.
So we talk about sea level rise as being the hazard, if you like, and in other areas of the high flood management area, we talk about, you know, the river flooding and rainfall and, you know, that kind of thing. There are other flooding, so storm surge and those kind of things that affect the coastal area that aren't necessarily to do with sea level rise, which is, you know, slow but increasing, but are exacerbated by climate change and warmer sea temperatures and those kind of things. And so we're likely to have higher storm surges and greater storms, if you like. Is that captured anywhere in the hazard assessments for flooding at this stage, or are we leaving that for coastal hazards?
Yeah, it's part of the future coastal hazards work to take into account those risks.
Okay.
It's not something that we've had tested in front of a hearings panel or done the work to do yet.
Okay, and I'm interested that in the report that apart from timing, there weren't any disadvantages that staff saw for this option today. None at all. Not worried at all about additional properties being built close to the coast, and we were in areas we're being asked to defend and protect and eventually buy out.
What the advantages and disadvantages relate to is on the basis we're not relitigating the decision in the direction that council have already provided. If you're articulating in the broader sense whether building in a high flood management area is a good thing, then those decisions again were made by the independent hearings panel.
Correct.
And what we're now doing is giving effect to, as Leanne says, what we believe the independent hearings panel provided by way of relief for those areas. But in the broader sense, as you say, Sarah, that this is the flooding as a result of sea level rise isn't a hazard in this location currently, but on the current trajectories and given the even more recent information that's come out, so I'm sure councillors are aware that IPCC released a report last week, and that had fairly certain and catastrophic forecasts for what the impact of climate change and sea level rise would be, not just on flooding but actually on all of us, on everything. So I would encourage you to read that, and that's got kind of the basis for some of the same underlying predictions that we'd made with the 1 metre sea level rise. The latest IPCC report simply reinforces and probably brings forward some of those timeframes.
Thanks. Yep. Good. Dion, did you have a question?
No. My question was kind of answered with...
Oh, sorry. No, sorry. I sort of kind of sidetracked, but nobody was asking any questions. Did you have a question? Pauline.
Yeah, so properties that will now find it easier to use existing use rights and rebuild where there was a house will have to mitigate for sea level rise, or on a case-by-case basis, or will they all be required to do something?
The rebuilding ones with the permitted activity rule, they will not require a resource consent in terms of being in the residential unit overlay or the high flood hazard management area, but they will still be required to meet floor levels within the broader flood management area, so that will mitigate some risk.
And will the broader flood management area be sufficient to protect them from sea level rise as well?
Well, at some point in time, no. If the sea keeps on rising, no. But I think the question is, when does that become unacceptable?
That's right.
And part of that rule was about recognising that there were properties, maybe the next door neighbour, who was able to rebuild it as they were under the
Just a timing issue.
P1, and these people weren't allowed to, and there's not really a differentiation between the two other than a timing.
Time related to when the home was demolished, in a sense.
Though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Dion? Phil?
Again, thank you very much for huge work on this. Just got a couple of concerns. One that you've just referred to with the new reports that are available. So, like all the work that, for example, this council asked for on multiple hazards, as against the sea level rise being a major or predominant sort of hazard. Did the district plan, it doesn't seem to take that into account.
Right, well, it takes into account the best information and the evidence that we presented at the time, which broadly was a metre worth of sea level rise in these locations. But the last week's report from the IPCC and next year's report and the report in 3 and 5 and 10 years' time, with the current trajectories, my non-scientific impression of where that will go is that the timeframes for when those hazards will exist will get closer and closer.
So what I don't see though, like, is reference to the multiple hazards that Sarah referred to, and why are we not also taking those into account when they were very clear in the Tonkin and Taylor report?
Yeah, but can I just interject on this? We're giving effect to the independent hearings panel decision. We're not relitigating the issue. So, I mean, it's all very well to ask staff to comment on something. There will be another time when we will discuss all of these things when we get to the coastal hazards chapter, but the time is really not now. The time is to focus on whether we have an effective district plan for implementing the rule that was determined by the independent hearings panel. They were the ones who heard the evidence. They were the ones who said we will grant relief, and the relief will be in the form of a residential unit overlay.
So I understand, and with respect though, I guess my concern is that since this is asking in effect for a change in the district plan, that why I'm asking the staff this question is this change appropriate given this new knowledge, including the Tonkin and Taylor report that we have?
This change is appropriate to give effect to the relief that the independent hearings panel granted to those properties in the residential unit overlay. And remember, the residential unit overlay was the subset of the high flood management area that was predominantly affected, will be predominantly affected by future sea level rise. So it's an area that's not currently at risk of flooding. It will be at risk of flooding from sea level rise in the future. That's not to say it doesn't have other hazards, though. It does have other hazards, as do every other location across the city, whether it's groundwater or liquefaction. So, but they're all covered in separate chapters and decisions of the IHP. So this one does relate to the residential unit overlay, a future hazard from sea level rise, from flooding as a result of sea level rise.
So is it possible that when, for example, we do consider the whole coastal hazard chapter, that in fact further mitigation may be required?
Yes, absolutely.
And that will need to be technically feasible
Exactly right.
and affordable.
Yep.
And at that point, an approach can be taken to the entire area rather than imposed on individual properties as well. So it's an opportunity.
Thank you. So my last question is, I've been wondering about this for a while. When is there any time when, in fact, as a council, we will be considering that coastal hazard chapter?
What we're waiting for is, what we're working through is the regeneration strategy for South Shore and South New Brighton, and what we're trying to achieve through that regeneration strategy is a more collaborative way of working with the community in terms of understanding and education, rather than starting at a kind of judicial process to make rules that then resisted against and people don't understand. So that piece of work is working through in I think the first or second quarter next calendar year. We're expecting the regeneration strategy, and post that then we'll have a kind of guide map for how we believe we should go about doing the coastal hazards chapter, so it'll be later in next calendar year.
Later in 2019. Thank you.
I think it's designed for very much a focus on adaptive management, so that how do you look ahead into, what is, a future which has elements of it which are certain, the timing of which are uncertain, and how do you then work with communities to, be adaptive in that environment. And if you're modelling, computer modelling, it's so reliable, as we know, like weather forecasting, and so what do you plan for in the future? You've got to look at where you said you were going to be in 10 years' time, and look back, and then ask yourself whether you're going to readjust for the future. I mean, I think it's actually quite exciting to develop a model of working with a community in a way that we've never done before. Anyway. Aaron, did you have a question? Tim? I've let past Glenn. Glenn, have you got a question from
That's
Ada?
okay. Yeah, I've got a couple. Can you hear me okay?
Unfortunately. Oh, yes.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
I'm
we
here.
can. We can hear you.
Okay. Oh, great. I've got a couple of 5.2 fairness and equity question, and mine is around the fact that some residents in South Shore have had a building consent, but when it's actually come to build, obviously they've been advised about having a resource consent, but they've then been turned down. So is the intention of point 2 to straighten that out? So it's a justice question.
It's referring to P2. Just trying to decipher the question.
I thought that's why we were here.
So if you're talking about...
So it's that the council grants one consent but not the other, so...
Well, the council can grant one consent and not the other. They're considered against different matters, so they are different considerations. So, as you said, Glenn, you can receive a building consent but not have a resource consent. The matters that we're talking about today relate to resource consents, though. So both the policy change to the residential unit overlay and also the P2 relate to a resource consent process, not a building consent.
All right. Next question. Glenn, come on. Yeah. We've lost him. Okay. Tim.
Moving on.
Following on from Glenn's question, though, as a council, and we've gone down trying to get rid of siloing, etc., but isn't going for a building consent and going through that process and working with our building consent team and then finding that you need a resource consent a classic case of siloing?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's a case where we do encourage people at the very front end, if you are planning on purchasing property, if you're planning on redeveloping, if you're planning on building in any location, to get good planning advice, and good planning advice will consider both the resource consent matters and also the building consent matters. So it's not a case of silos within the council. The RMA and the Building Act are separate pieces of legislation. We need to consider them in that context. So we do really encourage people to get good quality planning and legal advice, and in our experience that makes the world of difference, so that people understand what they're getting into and what their decisions are and whether they're prepared to take on those challenges.
So when our staff give the residents in that position that first step of going down that road, do they at times sit with both resource consent and building consent staff to understand the issue and the problem that they're facing?
No, people generally don't have sufficient material for a building consent at that stage. So the first step in the matter would be our advice to understand the resource consent constraints before designing and drawing up plans for the house that require a building consent.
Okay.
Can I step in there, Tim? Sorry, just to add to what Brendan said. When we get a building consent, the first thing we do is do what we call a PIM, and then we do a planning check. And we've picked up quite a few properties. We've done the planning check to say, actually, do you realise you're in this overlay and you actually need a resource consent? And do they want to continue? So, but quite often people have already invested quite a bit of money into design at that stage. So we do pick it up, but we don't know what people are going to do. And as Brendan said, we advise to get good advice and to come and see us early before they even start engaging with architects, etc.
So it's really the advice when they're doing a property check or whatever, when they're purchasing a property, that's where that should come out.
And if they're buying a property, on the limit will show where they are. Their lawyer should be guiding them. Yeah. We have had instances of people bought property down there who have said they've had a limb, but they actually haven't had a limb. Okay. We can't give better advice and always get a limb and get good legal advice around what those provisions in it mean.
Okay, thank you. Secondly, I do apologise for the late question I sent through. I've just been made aware late last week of the couple with those properties. And I'm just wondering if there's any light on those, because one is a section which was vacant, and so that they presume they cannot build or do anything with that property, So is this going to assist them in that at all?
These are the two properties in Hunter Terrace
Yes,
on the
yep.
Heathcote?
Yep.
No, it doesn't apply to them.
So they are, so that section basically is unusable.
Well, I assume these two properties in Hunter Terrace are in the high flood management area,
Yeah,
but
well,
they'll be in the area because of river flooding, which is a current risk, which is the distinction between the residential unit overlay, which is a future risk from sea level rise predominantly.
So the council's bought the property on one side because of the flooding. Their house has been flooded several times underfloor though, and so just to repeat, so where do they stand? So this does not affect them at all. They're back to square one prior to the high flood hazard management area.
Well, I don't know what the circumstances of those properties are, but the Section 71 proposal in the residential unit overlay doesn't affect them.
Okay. Just as a kind of a separate question, when people are going to rebuild in these areas or wherever they are going to rebuild in an area that is affected by flooding, should we not as a council be looking at, with regards to the building of these properties once they're allowed to, of what type of building they are allowed to build? Because it would seem that it's a given that higher water rise is coming, and so therefore rather than building solid foundations that we would build like pole type foundations. I realise it's probably a question for the future, but it seems to be here now.
No, it's a question for right now, and that's exactly what we do. That's part of one of the ways that you can mitigate against the hazard.
Yeah.
So rather than restricting the resource consent to build in the area, that we should be saying that you are limited to the type of foundation, so the house is either movable or designed to let water flow under and come out again until the point where it's...
Yeah, this is actually one of the reasons why I quite like to see the restricted discretionary rules set out in the document that you're sending to strategic partners. I know that you refer to them as including ... but it might actually be better to write the restricted discretionary rules because they pick up all your points.
Well, I mean, the reason we are sitting here is because a number of people are confused and are affected. This is the whole reason we are sitting here, isn't it? So if we can make it as clear as possible and put some, I think, reasonable and common sense restrictions into the actual building.
This is the discretion. The council's discretion is limited to the following matters: setting of minimum floor levels, design of buildings, mitigation of the effects of flooding, level of intensification, safe ingress and egress, reducing the risk to people's safety, wellbeing and property resulting from the development, and then they are assessed against the following criteria: the type of foundation structure proposed for the residential unit and the likely impact of the building with regard to flood storage and flow of water. So it's all exactly the points that you're raising. It's all within the restricted discretion of the decision around the resource consent. Spot on. Yanni.
I just want to check a process question. If we agree today to circulate this to our strategic partners, when it comes back, we're then in a position to be able to make changes.
Yes.
But what we can't do is get the minister to make changes once she's sought written feedback.
Correct. Correct.
So if councillors have any concerns about the final policy, or in terms of, or there's been a number of questions and comments made today, the best time to address that would be at the next council meeting when we've had the strategic partners' feedback. Is that?
Oh, well, before the next council meeting. So we're a strategic partner. So if there are things that you want us to change, then let us know now. And then when we come back to council, because we are trying to keep this on a fast track as well, when we come back to council, it would be great to have flushed out all of the concerns and issues. And so then the version that we bring back to council before the 8th of November is the penultimate version.
Sure, but rather than spend a whole bunch of time today trying to come up with amendments and things like that, the key thing today is, as I understand it, is to notify it to our strategic partners, and then we have a chance to work through and come up at the end of that process a refined policy or position.
In terms of fairness of process for the strategic partners, I'd suggest that it would be preferable if the council has flushed out, as Brendan has said, all significant changes that the council might want to make to it now before giving it to the strategic partners, because otherwise the strategic partners are commenting on a version that the council then substantively changes for other reasons.
Okay. Yes. That is good advice.
And then just so, I mean, thank you for the seminar that you gave with the community boards, and I guess some of us have had more information because we attended that than others. But I just wanted to check in regards to the feedback. Obviously, we've heard that there's one group that's not happy, and I'm just really not quite clear what the process is for resolving those South New Brighton issues, or what the time frame is. And given that that's feedback that's come in, are we able just to get a very clear time frame for what is being done when in that regard?
It is separate from this issue. Well, I mean, it is. No, it doesn't overlap. They are raising a separate concern about another matter, and it has been long-standing, and I do want to see it resolved as well. But this isn't the time to do that.
How do we acknowledge the feedback concern that's been raised?
Oh, well, I think we can acknowledge the feedback and concerns. What's been sought by the South Brighton Residents Association, the crux of it is, we believe the council would do better to request the Minister suspend the district plan until the above matters have been dealt with relating to the earthquake and historical issues. We should be communicating our comments to the Minister in the course of the legislative process. So the reality of this situation is that we can't do both of those. We can't proceed with this by Section 71, and we can't do what Hugo's suggested.
Yeah. Okay.
Just for those of us that aren't involved as local councillors, and maybe the local council has a view, but that whole South Brighton, South Shore issue just seems to keep dragging on and on and on, and I do think... It's not South Shore, it's South New Brighton.
Yeah.
It just seems it would be really good, you know, to get, when this comes back, a really clear time frame around what has been done and when decisions will be made.
Yeah.
It's not related to this piece of work.
No, but
council have made a large number of resolutions relating to work for both the South New Brighton area and also the South Shore area, so those are being progressed.
Yeah, could we take it offline, because I'd quite like to find a mechanism for what Yanni's asking for. It's just not this process this time. We have Glenn back online, who has another question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry, the phone call died on me, but it was just over the time limits on consents where they may have expired. What can we do about that? Are we effectively putting in place a stop-the-clock mechanism?
Are they resource consents or building consents, Glenn?
Building. My understanding is both consents usually expire, you know, after a certain period of time unless they're taken up. So
you're thinking of existing
this
use
is another
rights.
concern of residents too.
We're actually solving that problem with the P2, aren't we? So
yeah, I'm not totally sure what the question is focusing on, Councillor, but there's a provision in the RMA that says that if you get a resource consent, the resource consent lapses if you don't act on it. And in the RMA it says it lapses after 5 years, unless there's something else that's written into the resource consent that gives you a longer lapsing date. So that's one aspect maybe of what you're talking about in terms of a consent expiring. What's being proposed in the officer's report here has got nothing to do with that. So that lapsing date for resource consents in the RMA will still apply. And there's no proposal to change that. The other aspect of a consent lapsing that you might be thinking about is that if a resource consent is granted for a fixed term, then the consent ends when the term ends. So if a council grants a resource consent for something to happen for 40 years, then it has to stop after 40 years. Maybe it's that aspect you're referring to?
Well, no, it's more the first that, and I'm thinking by virtue of this strung out process and uncertainty that some consents actually have expired, but yeah, maybe I haven't heard that right, but that's been my understanding, that some residents have felt quite exasperated because their consents have expired, and yeah, I just thought we would need a stop the clock mechanism in there.
Yeah, if someone's getting concerned that they've got a resource consent and they haven't implemented it and it's soon to expire, they can apply to the council to extend it, or they can apply for a new consent. So there are some options.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Yep, all good.
Thanks, Glenn. Just the question I have is that in going back to strategic partners, originally to alert them to a decision being made by this council on the 23rd of October, but now the 15th, they've committed to really trying to work within the 7 days as is, in which case could we request staff to report back to council on the 1st of November if you have all of the appropriate feedback and are able to do that within the time frame?
Absolutely, that's the date I'm working to.
Great. So we're all on the same page. So if we could just put request that staff report back on 1 November 2018. It's just that because that would be an ideal meeting, because that is the community board meeting, and the two affected community board areas will be in front of the committee, in front of the council on that day. So it would be just an ideal day to undertake that. And as I say, I'm really pleased that you've worked on this, but we're going to give you an out, because you never know with strategic partners. They're going to do the best that they can.
I have great confidence in them.
And then just put in brackets after 1st of November, you know, providing that strategic partners have provided advice.
They've all been well engaged in this process and been really positive and fantastic. So, without wanting to get ahead of ourselves, I am appreciative of the.
Or provided strategic partners support the. Yeah.
Well, they need to provide the advice back, their comments back. So, but
yes, but support a support the Section 71 process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And have provided advice. Yeah. Okay. The other thing is that I'm just wondering, can we just note in there that you'll put the restricted discretionary stuff into the accompanying information?
Sure.
It doesn't have to be in the notification. It's just, I just kind of want it to be crystal clear that you know, that it is the restricted discretion rules. You know, as Tim's kind of pointed out, it's, you know, that they are the key factors of the decision-making criteria that are going to be applied in this area, as they have been, absent the policy. It's and there was just one other little thing. Discreation. That's a good word. Yep. Oh, yeah, I got a sense around the table that people were quite keen to see a legal opinion of the final wording that we come up with. And I don't know whether, and I know Sarah's Dawson's a planner, but I'm just wondering whether we should get a final sort of opinion and from her, and also an opinion from, I don't know, is it Brookfield, since Brookfields have already looked at it, them again to just finally wrap up what we're sending off to the Minister?
Yeah, we've got the advice from Brookfields that's attached to the report about the current wording proposed in the report for the policy itself. So if there's any changes proposed to that wording, we can get a fresh piece of legal advice
about
those changes.
I thought that didn't cover P2.
No, it's about the policy. It doesn't cover P2.
Yeah.
We can get legal advice, or I can give you legal advice about how P2 works. P2 does quite a different thing from the changes to the policy.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I was just listening to people's questions, and I thought that perhaps it might give a degree of comfort if both Sarah and the legal people were.
It wouldn't be appropriate, in my opinion, Mayor, to go back to the planner to ask her for advice, or not legal advice at least, about how the P2 works. The other thing I expect she will say is that her comments so far have been about how the change to the policy reflects her understanding of the panel's decision in relation to the residential unit overlay.
Yeah.
Now, what P2 does is address a slightly different problem, which is to do with a word existing in P1, because what we've got in the plan is a rule that says it's a permitted activity to replace an existing house.
Yes.
And because of that word existing, that's the issue. It's not really about the residential unit overlay per se. It's just about that word existing. As a result of that word existing being in that permitted activity P1, it means that if the house was demolished between the earthquakes and the date that rule took legal effect, then the house wasn't existing. So that person needs to go through a resource consent process. Whereas if the demolition happened one day after that rule took legal effect, then their replacement is a permitted activity. So it's just that, as Brendan said earlier, it's just that fairness issue that P1.
Yeah, no, I understood what you were doing with the status. So yeah, okay. I'm just kind of listening to what people were saying and thinking people wanted a, sort of a robust process. But you're going to come back to us on all the other stuff that the CCRU and others mentioned.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'd like to move the.
Resolution 4, so including the restricted discretionary rules where.
And the supplementary, in the accompanying advice to strategic partners. Good. You'd like to second it? Seconded by David East. All right, so I'll open it up for discussion. Sarah.
Thank you. So the intent of this process that we're going through is really clear. It's to make it easier for those people who had homes in the residential unit overlay to rebuild them. And that's actually a good goal, and one that I'm happy to proceed with. It's a goal which doesn't increase the risk that they had before, or increase the risk to council should we be asked in the future to spend a lot of money initially defending and then buying out properties facing significant flooding, not only due to sea level rise, but to the increased ferocity of storms and height of storm surges due to climate change. When it comes to building on low-lying land where residents are already asking ratepayers to fund and build a bund to protect them from flooding and a hard edge to protect them from erosion, it is better to do this carefully than quickly. And I'm worried about the unintended consequences as we rush headlong through this process. I'm concerned that the addition of the new rule P2 means that apart from floor levels, we will be allowing people to build homes in a way that does not mitigate the impacts of sea level rise and other flooding hazards. We're also making it easier to effectively intensify the housing in this area by allowing additional new dwellings to be built before we have done the coastal hazards work that is needed. We've heard a lot about the social, emotional and financial costs facing these property owners, but let's turn our minds back to only a few years to the enormous social, emotional and financial costs faced by our communities after they were red zoned in areas where the council had allowed them to build in an inappropriate way, knowing that the hazard was there. It was interesting to read in the Brookfield lawyer's letter that residents building in Dunedin in some areas were being asked to sign a deed which specified that they would not complain about flooding or ask to be protected if they built a house in the flood hazard area. It's an approach that may be useful for us as well as might be useful for us as well, as residents in the area are already asking for us to spend significant amounts of ratepayer money on just that. Today, I'm cautiously all right for us to go ahead with the process, knowing that there is another stage to come, but I may not be happy to continue at the next stage. What's very clear is that the coastal hazards chapter of the district plan is essential, and I'm really looking forward for us getting that underway so that our coastal communities can have the certainty about their futures.
Glenn, did you want to contribute to the debate?
Yes, I may. Yes, I'd like to, if I could, please, and just pick up on that theme which Sarah has touched on over 70, that the problem is, I think it can be seen from at least two different sides of the fence, and I do hear, what's being said over taking the time to do it right. The problem is, if you live in these areas, you've been there 10 years already, so people want certainty. They actually want certainty yesterday, and I congratulate the staff on the speed with which this response is being undertaken, but for residents, it's been 7 years, and it's more than fair that we actually move to have this resolved now in what I can see is a responsible way. I'm happy with the fairness and equity issue attended to as per 5.2, and also obviously joining this up with the overall tenor of regeneration for the area. So it's mainly around certainty that is my greatest concern. Residents really have been in a no man's land for a long time. So let's keep this going. Recommend this to our strategic partners and maintain the momentum. And those would be my main points.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Phil?
Yes, thank you. And I'm pleased that we're at this point, councillors, because clearly there's been a fairness and equity issue for a lot of people, and I'm glad that the situation can be changed through the recommendations. But as I've indicated, I have got some concerns that while this is around adaptive management for everybody, and in fact, currently the policy is around the predominantly sea level rise only, as Councillor Templeton referred to. And I think we have to be aware that in fact, ongoing, as the effects of climate change come into place, there'll be more requests for mitigation, and it's really a question as to how we can afford to do those, and whether in fact they're going to be technically feasible. Because I think we're all clear that in fact we can't continue mitigating to the point where we will constantly be fighting nature. That is in the future. So, I think this decision fits today, and I guess that there is a legal opinion around what is for guidance on acceptable and unacceptable risk, and that comes back to being a matter for council. So, and I also think though that our future planning needs to be informed by the whole coastal hazards chapter, which we've yet to receive.
Tim?
Thank you. I think there's a difference between existing properties and new properties. I think that we do have to take an emotional stand for those people that have existing homes and have been there for some time, and generations perhaps, and we do have a responsibility as a city to look after those people. However, for new buildings on sections, building new, I think the example about the Dunedin and what they're doing with regards to, well, okay, you want to build here, that's your choice, but this city and the ratepayers of Christchurch take no responsibility. I think we should look at that and as a real possibility. But as I said before, I also think that we should be really looking carefully at what we're building and what we're replacing, because I drive along terraces and you see these houses, they are exactly the same as any other house except they are just higher. And we've got to look at those houses that are built to ebb and flow underneath and even be removed if required, because sooner or later, if sea level rise is a fact and is going to happen, we're the first generation that's recognising it, and we're the generation following us will be the ones that are truly affected by it, and we must leave the right legacy, and I don't believe we are doing that at this stage. Thank you.
Okay. David?
Thank you. Look, we're here today to approve, I hope, the proposal to amend the district plan in relationship to the residential unit overlay and give effect to the IHP decision. I am a little concerned that some members here are placing a lot of emphasis on our coastline, in particular South Shore, and would make the comment, as I've made before, if and when we get a 1 metre sea level rise, significant areas of the whole city will be affected, and I've seen plans that talk about sea level rise affecting right back to currently where Lancaster Park is. So I do get a little bit concerned at times when we are just referring to sea level rise and pointing the finger entirely at our coastline. I'd like to commend the wording that has been proposed and Sarah Dawson for her input into this process. I'd also like to emphasise and commend the P2 inclusion. This was a step that was over and above what our communities expected. In fact, some of them were quite astounded that we'd gone that far, and they were absolutely delighted. So I'd like to express on behalf of my communities out there, thanks to Mikey, to David, John, Nathan, Brent, and to Brendan for all the work that has gone into this fairly quick process to get to where we are now. I think it's a great process that gives the residents in the residential unit overlay area confidence going forward and corrects the situation that's caused a whole deal of angst and stress in this community. Finally, I'd just like to emphasise, I think, you know, we live in an age where things are changing. We are getting a lot of scientific commentary, but I also really want to reflect on the process that going forward that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has so aptly, or the former Commissioner, has so aptly said, we have time. We need to consider adaptive management and move with the processes going forward. So I'm really a great fan of adaptive management, and I think we have the time and the place to be able to look at our adaptation to climate change in a structured and measured manner as we go forward. So I thank the staff and everybody involved for the process that we have gone through in the last few weeks to get to where we are today. I'm confident that our strategic partners will assess this proposal objectively, constructively, and come back with their opinions very quickly. And I'm ever so confident that we can get this before the Minister before Christmas and have this correction in place and give our communities the relief that they have looked for some time. There is also, as we have seen today, some concerns that have been raised by the South Brighton community, and they in general reflect around the regeneration strategy that is being evolved, and I would really urge that this council give some urgency to getting that process finalised so that we can constructively give that community a little bit more surety as well. So I'm very impressed with what's happened, and thanks staff again for their efforts in this process.
Aaron and then Yanni.
Yeah, I think most things have been said on this subject, and I'd put my hand up before Dave mentioned the letter read out before from the South Brighton Residents Association. That's the only bit I'd like to speak to, because that is the real and that is the now, what they're referring to, and the work that hasn't been done in the 8 years since the quakes, when the land moved and dropped and broke down the edges of their community to let water come in at a greater rate than would be expected pre-quake. That's a physical job that can be done by this council and should be done and should have been done already. You know, climate change and tidal surges and global warming and all those other things are all modelling. No one can show an exact model of what's going to happen, but the LiDAR readings from South Brighton can show you what has happened and what hasn't been fixed by this council. So we should take heed of that notice that came through and actually get on and get that part done, as well as do this and take heed of all the warnings. But the stuff and the damage that's already been done needs fixing, and needs fixing probably about 5 years ago.
Yanni?
Yeah, Excuse me. So, I mean, I support us notifying this to our strategic partners. I just want to make it really clear that this doesn't automatically give people the right to build anything they like on this land. Actually, what this does in terms of the policy is actually really clear. It provides for development of a residential unit on residentially zoned land where the flooding risk is predominantly influenced by sea level rise, and critical point here, and where appropriate mitigation can be provided that protects people's safety, well-being and property from unacceptable risk. And in all other cases, and it goes on to say, avoid subdivision or development. So, you know, there is a process by which staff will have to go through and assess the suitability of what's been proposed in terms of development. What this doesn't do, as the previous one did, is say just avoid and leave it at that. And I think it was been really clear that although the IHP didn't put the specific policy in, it was their intention through their deliberations to have a rule in place that enabled that consideration to occur, and that's what we're doing today. We're fixing the omission from the IHP that I think should have been in there that wasn't, and community have come to us and shown us clearly where that is. This still doesn't make it easy for people to get development rights in these areas. They still have to go through a fairly extensive process, I think, to be enabled to develop, and so I'm comfortable with what's being proposed. I do want to thank and acknowledge our staff for the huge amount of work that they've done in regards to this issue. I think, you know, it's been really great to see the quick turnaround and the huge level of thought that's gone into what's being proposed. So I will support it. I do think that there's some wider lessons that we need at some stage, maybe the symposium or maybe at a future date, to consider. And that is the point around post-earthquake, this whole ridiculous situation of having so many different agencies and layers of bureaucracy when it comes to things like planning that mean that you get, you know, stuff happening in South New Brighton and South Shore that's separate from district planning, that's separate from the decision making, whether it's council or independent hearing panels or, you know, governments and ministers. It just, the whole spaghetti junction of post-earthquake bureaucracy has actually created huge difficulties for people understanding what processes are being put in place. And I think, you know, let's reflect on that at the appropriate stage, because we do want to address sea level rise and we do want to address coastal hazards, but the current framework by which we're working in, it does seem very confused for not only the public, but also for many of us who are involved. So let's try and deal with the South Brighton stuff, I think, South New Brighton, as quick as possible, because I totally take on board the feedback we've had from that group. I've been down and had a look at that area, and it's very clear that something needs to happen urgently in that regard. But thanks to staff for the work that they've done. Let's notify this to our strategic partners. We can have a substantive debate when this comes back and we get that feedback back. And I think that's the point where people can really express their views strongly.
Anyone else that wants to comment? Because I'll just close off the debate if not. Look, thank you very much, everyone, for contributing to this important issue. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is that if we are to go down the track of working with our communities to develop what is a really important way of working together, which is this adaptive management approach to the future, you know, the results of which are certain but the timing of which is uncertain, then I think we have to build trust and confidence. And I think that's what's been missing from the conversations that we've been having to date in relation to what has been a significant loss in trust and confidence. You know, and I've felt it myself. You know, I've attended the meetings where I felt that, you know, we've got to do a lot of work to reinstate a level of trust and confidence in order to be able to work collaboratively with our communities. Now, as I said right at the very start of this process, it's a two-way process and it's got to go both ways. And I've kind of been a little bit disappointed that I haven't seen more about this meeting on the various websites, you know, from the CCRU and the different residents associations, you know, really sort of talking up the process that we're now undertaking. The Section 71 process is technical and overly complex. It was not designed for a minor correction to a district plan, and so I really want us to be able to send out communications into these communities to explain what we're doing. I mean, one of the conversations that I had with one of the members of the IHP was that it was really, really important for people to understand that this doesn't remove the obligation, or if it's successful, it won't remove the obligation to get a resource consent for those in the residential unit overlay. But the terms under which the resource consent are considered by way of discretion are restricted. So there's a restricted list. But that's what the independent hearings panel decided. They were the ones that heard the residents from South Shore, South Brighton in particular, but the CCRU representing Redcliffs as well. And they were crystal clear in the IHP's thinking that this was something that could be worked towards in the future, because the high flood hazard risk wasn't present. It wasn't present day risk, it was future risk. And so therefore how we would build houses in these areas was very much about ensuring that we were able to look to the future. But we're going to have to work through these technical and complex issues collaboratively. We need to help build understanding, but most of all we need to build trust. So I'm again reaching out to the community boards, I'm reaching out to the CCRU and the residents associations, and I'm saying we need to work together on this. We need to build public understanding of what the rules are, and please use your Facebook pages to tell people what the council's doing, what the process is. We're happy to help, you know, write the communications. We're happy to assist as much as we possibly can, but we're in this together, and by, you know, working together, we're going to be able to make the changes that need to be made. And finally, just again to thank staff for an incredible job. I've not seen such an incredible commitment, you know, really to get something back in front of council at such a quick turnaround. I'm incredibly impressed, and I know that there's a team of people sitting behind the ones at the end of the table, so please pass on our grateful thanks. Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
Aye.
That was an aye, a belated one.
Yeah, what?
That's carried. Thank you very much. So that's the work done for this morning's session, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.